As the morning light spills across my living room, I hear the agent say my daughter told him I'd be out soon. Still, I wrap my fingers tighter around the warm coffee mug, keeping my voice steady. While the same light crawls along the floorboards, his words echo louder than they should. The same light touches every corner I built my life in, reminding me what I survived here. That's when the light makes it clear she didn't doubt my house. She doubted my agency. Still, I smile in that light, deciding to buy the house next door and stay exactly where I am. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Margaret sat in the living room, a place that had been her refuge for so many years. The room was warm, bathed in the soft glow of morning light. With its high ceilings and walls that held memories of laughter, of conversations, of James. The polished wood floors gleamed underfoot, and the familiar scent of leather and old books filled the air. Carlos, her trusted real estate agent, sat across from her, flipping through his papers as they discussed the possibility of selling her longtime family home. "So, Margaret," Carlos began, his voice measured but carrying the weight of something more. "I had a chat with Lily the other day. She mentioned the house, said you'd be out soon." The words hit Margaret like a cold wave. Out soon. She stared at Carlos, her fingers tightening around her coffee mug, feeling a strange sensation twist in her chest. Out soon? It wasn't the suggestion that stung, it was the assumption. The idea that Lily had already decided for her, as if Margaret had no say in the matter. Carlos seemed to realize something was wrong immediately. He shifted in his seat, a bit uncomfortable. "I'm sure she didn't mean it the way it sounds. She probably just thought it was time to move on." Margaret cut him off, her voice sharp despite herself. "No, it's fine." Her tone was forced, but she couldn't hide the rising tide of frustration. She just assumed, didn't she? Carlos hesitated, a bit taken aback. "I think she meant well, just—" But Margaret wasn't listening. She was already lost in the weight of the moment. Out soon. That simple phrase, said casually, had shaken her in ways she hadn't anticipated. It felt as though her own daughter had made a decision for her, without even considering how Margaret might feel about it. Lily had been talking about selling the house for months now, suggesting Margaret downsize, move to something easier to manage. It was practical, she'd said, logical. But this was something else. This was Lily deciding that Margaret's time in this house had come to an end. Margaret turned away from Carlos, her eyes fixed on the distant garden outside, her mind racing. She had spent so many years here, in this home that had once been filled with the sounds of family. Every corner of this house told a story of her life with James, of their shared dreams, their struggles, their triumphs. It was more than just a building. It was a testament to her independence, her resilience, her survival after the hardest loss of her life. "Lily thinks I'm just going to walk away, doesn't she?" Margaret muttered, more to herself than to Carlos. Carlos cleared his throat, uneasy. "Margaret, I'm sure she didn't mean—" Margaret cut him off again, her voice low but firm. "I don't care what she meant. She doesn't get to decide that for me." Carlos fell silent, watching her closely. He knew Margaret well enough to know that once her mind was made up, there was no changing it. But he also knew her well enough to understand that this wasn't just about a house. This was about something deeper. Margaret stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the backyard. She could see the house next door, the modern structure with its sleek lines and manicured lawn. It was a beautiful property, nothing like her own. The thought crept into her mind, unbidden but certain. Maybe it's time for a change. Maybe it's time for me to take control again. "Carlos," she said, her voice now steady, "set up a viewing for the house next door." Carlos blinked, clearly surprised. "You're interested in buying it?" Margaret's lips curved slightly, her eyes narrowing with determination. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly. But I won't let anyone, especially not my daughter, think they can push me out of my own life. Carlos didn't argue. He knew better than to question Margaret when she was like this. He nodded, pulling out his phone to make the arrangements. As Margaret stood there, looking out at the house next door, something inside her shifted. No one decides for me, she thought. Not Lily. Not anyone. This was her life. And if she had to show Lily and the world that she was still in control, she would. And so, Margaret made the first move. The house next door loomed large in Margaret's mind as she paced the floor of her own home. She had thought about it all night, how it would feel to leave behind everything she knew. The house was old, filled with memories of James, but also the memories of herself. Independent, strong, and free. No one would make her feel like she was disposable. And yet, out soon, those two words casually dropped by Lily had unraveled something inside her. The decision to buy the house next door wasn't just about real estate. It was about reclaiming her life. It was about refusing to be treated like she didn't have a say in her own future. The house, sleek and modern with its glass windows and manicured lawn, was the antithesis of her own cozy, lived-in home. But it was hers, and that was what mattered. She dialed Carlos's number with a quiet resolve. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "Carlos, it's Margaret. Set up a viewing for the house next door," she said, the words coming easily now. She felt a surge of power with each syllable. "Margaret, are you sure?" Carlos's voice was cautious. "I mean, you've been considering selling your place and buying another. That's a big move." Margaret paused, staring out the window, her gaze falling on the house. "I'm sure," she replied, her tone unwavering. "I need to see it. I'm not selling this house, Carlos, but I'm not letting anyone push me out either." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Carlos spoke again, this time softer. "All right, I'll set it up for you." Margaret hung up the phone, her mind already racing through possibilities. A part of her felt the pull of practicality. Maybe it would be wise to sell. Downsize, live simpler. But that wasn't the answer. She wasn't ready to let go of the space that had been her sanctuary. Not because it was too big, but because it was hers. The thought of leaving it behind felt like giving up a part of herself. She walked to the window, peering across the yard. The house next door stood still, its sharp, clean lines almost mocking the warmth and history of her own. She had spent years building her life here, each room a memory, each corner a story. The idea of starting fresh in a new space was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. But it wasn't about the house. It was about reclaiming control, taking a step that no one expected, especially Lily. As Margaret stood there, Sophie's voice came back to her, a memory from a conversation they'd had just weeks earlier. "You're stronger than you think, Margaret. Don't let anyone tell you what you can or can't do with your life." That was it, wasn't it? This wasn't just about real estate, it was about independence. Margaret wasn't just making a decision about property, she was making a stand. She would not be pushed out of her own life. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. And Sophie entered, as calm and composed as always. Sophie was her anchor, the one person who could always bring Margaret back to her center when she was feeling off balance. "I brought lunch," Sophie said, setting down a bag of food on the kitchen table. She gave Margaret a knowing look. "I can tell something's on your mind." Margaret sighed, feeling the weight of the situation settle on her shoulders. She explained everything to Sophie, how Lily had assumed she was ready to sell, how the house next door had caught her eye, and how, despite her doubts, she felt a pull to make the decision. Sophie listened quietly, her sharp eyes never leaving Margaret's face. When she was done speaking, Sophie sat back, nodding slowly. "You know what you're doing, Margaret. You're not just buying a house, you're taking control back. And that's exactly what you need to do." Margaret's heart lifted slightly at Sophie's words, the reassurance sinking in. Sophie had always been the one who reminded her of her strength when she forgot it. You've spent your life building something, Margaret. This house, your business, your independence. Don't let anyone, especially Lily, make you think you don't deserve it. This is your decision. You've earned the right to choose. Margaret smiled, the tightness in her chest loosening. Sophie was right. This wasn't about giving in. It was about proving that she still had a say in her future. I'm going to do it, Margaret said, a firm resolve settling in her voice. I'm not letting anyone dictate my life, not even Lily. Sophie's eyes softened. Good for you. You deserve to be happy, Margaret, and this is just the beginning. Margaret stood, walking over to the window again, her mind now clear. She would go through with it. The house next door would be hers, and with it she would build something new. But there was still a lingering thought in the back of her mind. What would Lily say when she found out? Would she understand, or would it push them further apart? As the phone rang with Carlos's call to confirm the viewing time, Margaret's chest tightened again, but this time she held her ground. She wasn't just fighting for a house, she was fighting for herself. Margaret stared at the final paperwork, her signature neat and firm across the lines. The deal for the house next door was done. Despite the flutter of uncertainty in her chest, did she really need such a big commitment? She signed it with conviction. This wasn't just about buying property, it was about asserting her control over her life. No one, not even Lily, would dictate her next move. She set the pen down, taking a deep breath, her mind already shifting gears. There was still work to be done, details to sort through, plans to create. Her heart pounded in her chest as she dialed Carlos. She needed this kept quiet for now. Carlos, it's Margaret. I've made the offer, but I want to keep this between us. For now. I don't want anyone finding out yet, especially not Lily, she said, her voice sharp with intention. Carlos hesitated, and she could almost hear him considering the request. He knew Margaret well enough to know this was no small thing. All right, he said finally. I'll keep it confidential. But Margaret, are you sure? You've been talking about selling for a while. I'm sure, she said, her voice unshaken. But this is my decision, Carlos. I won't be pushed out of my own life. She hung up, her fingers tightening around the phone. She could feel the weight of what she had done. The house next door wasn't just a place to live. It was a symbol, a statement. She wasn't done yet. For the next few hours, Margaret threw herself into planning. She scrolled through design ideas, made calls to contractors, and began sketching out ideas for renovations. The house was modern, sleek, and empty. It wasn't her home yet, but soon it would be. It would reflect her, her taste, her independence. It would be hers, built with her own hands, a home she could call her own. Her phone buzzed, and it was a text from Lily. I was thinking, have you considered downsizing? A smaller place would be easier for you to handle, less upkeep, less stress. Margaret's thumb hovered over the screen. Downsizing. Again. That same suggestion, wrapped in concern, but really, it felt more like control, like Lily thought she knew what was best for Margaret. But Margaret was done with that. She typed a quick response. I'm fine here, Lily. I've got things under control. The message went unanswered, but Margaret didn't care. She'd said what she needed to. No more living by someone else's idea of what was best. She set her phone down and stood, walking to the window. Across the yard, the house next door stood, waiting for her. It felt like her next step, her next challenge. No one would push her around anymore. Not Lily, not anyone. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was from Carlos. Margaret, the contractors are ready to discuss the plans for the house tomorrow. Are you still on track for the renovations? Margaret smiled to herself. I'm more than ready, she replied, feeling a thrill run through her. This was just the beginning. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the papers in front of her a tangible reminder of the commitment she had just made. The house next door was now hers, a bold, irreversible decision. There was still some uncertainty in her chest, a flutter of doubt that came with any significant choice, but mostly, she felt calm. This was about control, about standing firm in her own life. Her phone buzzed, and Margaret's heart skipped a beat when she saw Lily's name flash on the screen. She answered, already bracing herself. "Hi, Mom," Lily said, her tone light, but with an underlying tension. "I was thinking about the house. Have you considered selling it sooner rather than later? The market's good right now, and we could move quickly." Margaret's chest tightened. She knew this conversation was coming. "I've thought about it," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm not selling it, Lily, not yet." Lily didn't respond immediately, and Margaret could sense the hesitation on the other end. "Well, okay," Lily finally said, though her voice was tight. "But you know, if you wanted to get it off your hands quickly, I could help. We could sell it, and you could move into something smaller, easier to manage." Margaret clenched her jaw, fighting the urge to snap back. Lily's well-meaning suggestions always had an undercurrent of control, but this time, Margaret wasn't going to let her dictate the terms. "I'm fine here, Lily," Margaret said calmly. "I've got everything under control." Lily didn't seem to hear the finality in her tone. She pressed on as though she were explaining a simple fact. "I'm just trying to make things easier for you, Mom. I thought you might like the idea of a smaller place. Somewhere you don't have to worry so much about upkeep." Margaret smiled to herself, the sting of frustration turning into a quiet resolve. She knew what Lily was really suggesting, her idea of what was best, but Margaret was done with that. "No, thank you, Lily. I'm happy with my decision," Margaret replied, her voice firm. Another silence stretched between them. Margaret could feel the weight of her daughter's expectations, the unspoken assumption that she would be on board with whatever Lily proposed. But Margaret had already made her choice. The house next door was hers, and no one, least of all her daughter, was going to take that away. "Okay, Mom," Lily finally said, her voice softer now, though tinged with disappointment. "I just want what's best for you." Margaret let out a quiet sigh. "I know you do, but this is my decision." She hung up the phone, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. That was done. Just as she began to settle back into her chair, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Carlos. "Margaret, I need to talk to you about something important regarding the property next door. Can we meet today?" Margaret's pulse quickened. What now? The first morning in her new house felt like stepping into an entirely different life. Margaret stood in the front hallway of the sleek, modern home next door, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting long, soft shadows on the freshly polished floors. The walls were a blank canvas, waiting for her personal touch. It was almost too quiet, too new, but there was a certain thrill in it, a freedom she hadn't felt in a long time. She looked around, taking in the clean lines and spaciousness of the place. It was so different from her old home, which was filled with memories of James and family. This house, with its sharp edges and minimalist design, was all hers. It wasn't just a house, it was a statement. It was her reclaiming her life, her independence. The house next door wasn't about what anyone expected. It was about what she wanted. Margaret walked across the living room, her fingers trailing along the cool marble countertops in the kitchen. She smiled to herself, imagining how it would feel to turn this blank space into her dream home. No more compromises, no more suggestions from Lily or anyone else. She could make it hers, exactly the way she wanted. The phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her from her thoughts. It was a message from Lily. "Just wanted to check in. Are you really sure about this, Mom? You don't have to make any hasty decisions." Margaret's lips tightened, but she didn't let herself get upset. Lily would always worry, always think she knew better, but Margaret had made her choice. She typed a quick response. I'm fine, Lily. Everything's settled. I'm happy here. She hit send and set the phone down, taking a deep breath as she surveyed the space again. She was determined to make this place feel like home. But just as she was about to start making plans, the doorbell rang. Margaret opened the door to find Lily standing there, her arms crossed, her brow furrowed in confusion. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her eyes scanning the house as if trying to understand what her mother was doing. "I thought you were just thinking about this," Lily said, her voice laced with disbelief. "When did this happen? Why didn't you talk to me?" Margaret kept her tone even, trying not to let Lily's surprise throw her off. "I've thought about it, Lily. I made the decision and I'm moving in. I don't need to explain it to you. This is my life." Lily shook her head, her frustration mounting. "But Mom, this is too much. Why move into something this big? Why not take the smaller house I suggested? It's simpler, more manageable. You don't need all this space." Margaret's gaze softened, but her resolve was clear. "I've earned this, Lily. I've worked hard for everything I have, and I have every right to enjoy the space I've chosen. I'm not moving for anyone else. Not for you, not for anyone." Lily looked at her, her face a mixture of confusion and frustration. "I don't understand," she said quietly, almost pleading. "Why can't you just be practical? This doesn't make sense." Margaret exhaled slowly. "It doesn't have to make sense to anyone but me. I'm not going anywhere, Lily. Not now, not ever, unless I choose to." Lily didn't respond right away. She stood there looking at Margaret, her eyes wide with disbelief. Then she turned and left without another word. Margaret watched her daughter leave, the door closing behind her with a quiet thud. She stood there for a long moment, taking in the weight of the conversation. But it didn't shake her. She was sure of her choice. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Carlos. "Evan Harris from next door is here. He wants to talk to you about buying the property for his development." Margaret frowned at the message. Evan, the local real estate developer who had been eyeing properties in the area for months. Margaret didn't need to be told that this wasn't about a friendly offer. It was about him trying to get what he wanted, just like Lily had tried. She wasn't interested. She typed back quickly, "Tell him I'm not selling." Carlos replied almost immediately, "Understood, I'll let him know." Margaret set the phone down again, this time with a sense of finality. She was done with people trying to make decisions for her. She turned back to the house, a spark of excitement lighting in her chest. There was work to be done. She had a vision for this place, and nothing, no one, was going to stop her from seeing it through. Margaret stood in the middle of her new home, looking at the transformation she had carefully crafted. The house was no longer a cold, modern shell. It was alive with warmth, color, and character. Each room reflected her vision, her independence, and her decision to start fresh. She ran her hand along the smooth granite countertops in the kitchen, smiling at the progress she had made. The phone buzzed, and Margaret glanced down to see a text from Lily. "Mom, are you really sure about this? You're making things difficult for yourself. Why not sell and move into something smaller? I can help." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. The suggestion wasn't new. She had heard it 100 times before, each one wrapped in the same veneer of concern. But she wasn't going to let it affect her this time. She quickly typed back, "I'm fine, Lily. Everything is settled. I'm happy here." She put the phone aside and took a deep breath, letting the quiet of her new home wash over her. She had made her decision. No more compromising. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She opened the door to find Lily standing on the porch, arms crossed, a mix of confusion and concern on her face. Lily stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her eyes scanning the sleek, modern space. "I thought you were just thinking about this," Lily said, disbelief in her voice. "When did this happen? Why didn't you talk to me?" Margaret remained calm, despite the tight knot in her stomach. "I've thought about it. I made my decision. I'm moving in. I don't need to explain myself." Lily shook her head, frustration mounting. But Mom, this is too much. Why not take the smaller house I suggested? It's more practical. You don't need all this space. Margaret met her daughter's gaze steadily, refusing to let her sway her. I've earned this. I worked hard for everything I have. I deserve to enjoy it on my own terms. Lily's expression softened for a moment, then tightened again. I just want you to be practical, Mom. Why can't you just make things easier on yourself? Margaret's heart gave a quiet pang, but her voice remained firm. It doesn't have to make sense to anyone but me. I'm not going anywhere. Lily stared at her, disbelief written all over her face. She opened her mouth to say something, but then turned and walked out without another word. Margaret watched her leave, the door closing softly behind her. It stung, but she couldn't let it shake her. She had made her choice. Just as she was about to take a deep breath, her phone buzzed again. A message from Carlos. Evan Harris is here. He wants to talk about buying the property for his development. Margaret's chest tightened. Evan. She wasn't interested, but she knew he wouldn't back down easily. She typed a quick response. Tell him I'm not selling. Carlos's reply came immediately. Understood. Margaret set her phone down with a sense of finality. She wasn't going to let anyone dictate her choices. Not Lily, not Evan, not anyone. Later that evening, she hosted a small gathering in her new home. Friends and neighbors wandered through, admiring the space she had turned into her own. She was proud of what she had accomplished. As the compliments poured in, Margaret couldn't help but smile. Then, Lily arrived, late as usual. Her jaw dropped as she took in the beauty of the transformation. For the first time, Margaret could see the surprise and something else in her daughter's eyes. Word had begun to spread around the neighborhood. Margaret's bold decision to buy the house next door, so unexpected, so defiantly hers, had captured the community's attention. People whispered about it at the local coffee shop, exchanged glances at the park, and even stopped by her house to admire the transformation. Her decision was becoming a symbol, a quiet rebellion against expectations. Margaret Thompson had chosen to live on her own terms, and it resonated with everyone around her. The day after her small gathering, Margaret found herself walking through the neighborhood, carrying the satisfaction of the previous evening's success like a badge. Her house, still fresh and new, seemed to glow in the morning light, drawing appreciative looks from neighbors as she passed. She noticed people giving her nods of approval and smiles that felt a little more genuine than the ones she'd received before. The whispers weren't just about the house now, they were about her. Even the local real estate agents had started to take notice. Carlos had told her that word about her bold move had spread far beyond her block, making her the talk of the neighborhood. People were curious, impressed, and even inspired. She wasn't just the woman who had bought the house next door. She was the woman who had defied expectations and done something for herself, unapologetically. But as much as Margaret was thriving in the new attention, Lily was struggling. Margaret had known her daughter would have a hard time with her independence, but seeing the resentment simmering in her eyes every time they spoke made it impossible to ignore. Lily was no longer just concerned. She was angry, frustrated that Margaret had taken control in a way she couldn't understand. And the more Margaret was admired by the community, the more Lily seemed to pull away. One evening, Sophie arrived with a quiet smile, her presence always a comfort. Margaret had been feeling the weight of the situation with Lily, but Sophie's calm demeanor grounded her. "You've made a big impact," Sophie said, nodding toward the street outside, where people continued to pass by with looks of admiration. "It's strange, isn't it?" Margaret replied, leaning against the kitchen counter. "People are looking at me like I'm some kind of example. I didn't expect this." "It's not strange," Sophie said, taking a seat across from her. "It's exactly what you've always been capable of. You've always been the one who broke the mold, Margaret. Now, people are noticing." Margaret smiled, grateful for Sophie's perspective. But there was still that nagging feeling in the back of her mind, Lily. She couldn't shake the image of her daughter's face when she had walked through the door during Margaret's gathering. The shock, the disappointment, the jealousy. She wasn't sure how to bridge that gap anymore. Sophie, reading the change in Margaret's demeanor, leaned forward. "You need to focus on what you've done, not what anyone else thinks. This is your victory, your time. It's okay to let go of expectations, especially when they come from people who still don't understand." Margaret took a deep breath, nodding slowly. Sophie was right. She had worked hard for this, and it wasn't about anyone else's approval. She wasn't going to let Lily's disappointment undermine what she had accomplished. Later that week, Margaret was invited to a local event, an evening gathering for community leaders to discuss the future of the neighborhood. It was the perfect opportunity for Margaret to share her story, not just as a new homeowner, but as a woman who had made her own path despite the obstacles. Sophie helped Margaret craft her speech, reminding her to focus not just on the decision but on the message she was delivering. "This is about more than just buying a house, Margaret," Sophie said. "It's about the way you've taken control of your own destiny. You're an example for others who feel stuck, who think they can't do something because the world has told them no." The night of the event, Margaret stood before the crowd, her nerves suddenly giving way to a surge of pride. She spoke about the importance of independence, the power of choice, and the courage it took to take that first step into the unknown. She talked about the house next door, not just as a property, but as a symbol of self-empowerment. As she spoke, she could see the impact in the room. People nodded, whispered to one another, and looked at her with admiration. When she finished, the applause felt like a quiet validation, not just for the house, but for everything she had done. She wasn't just a real estate investor. She was a woman who had defied expectations. And now, people were beginning to understand that. From across the room, Evan Harris stood watching. He had heard the rumors, seen the changes in the neighborhood, and now he saw Margaret standing before him, strong, confident, and unyielding. He had tried to buy her out, but watching her command the room, he realized he had underestimated her. She wasn't just a woman he could convince. She was a force to be reckoned with. Margaret's life was steadily becoming a whirlwind of attention. Her bold decision to buy the house next door had shaken the neighborhood, and now, everywhere she went, she was met with nods of approval, smiles of admiration. At the coffee shop, in the park, even at the grocery store, people spoke to her with a newfound respect. They saw her as someone who had taken charge of her own life, who had refused to conform to expectations. Margaret felt a quiet pride as she walked through the neighborhood, her house gleaming in the distance. This was her success, her independence. And it was being recognized. But there was always one voice that seemed to linger in her head, Lily's. Margaret hadn't expected her daughter to understand, but the distance between them had only grown. Lily had started playing the role of the dutiful daughter, but Margaret could sense the frustration and resentment simmering beneath her polite words. Every time they spoke, Lily seemed to drop hints, suggesting Margaret needed help, that she should reconsider her decision. One afternoon, Margaret received a call from her daughter. She'd been dreading it, but knew it was coming. "Mom," Lily began, her voice slightly strained, "I've been thinking again. This whole thing, it's just not practical. Why not sell the house and downsize? I could help you with that. You don't need all that space." Margaret's chest tightened as she listened. She had heard this same refrain over and over, and it wasn't just concern, it was control. "Lily," Margaret said, her voice calm but firm, "I'm not selling. I'm happy here. I've made my decision." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Lily spoke again, quieter this time. "I just want what's best for you, Mom. I'm not sure you're thinking clearly." Margaret felt the sting of those words, but she didn't let them show. "I've been thinking for a long time. This is my choice, and it's not about what you think is best for me. I'm doing this for myself." Lily didn't reply. Margaret could feel the frustration radiating through the silence. She had made her choice. There was no turning back now. As the days passed, Margaret pushed forward with her plans for the house. Renovations were underway, and the more she worked, the more her sense of independence grew. This was her project, her vision. She didn't need anyone's approval to make it happen. It wasn't long before Evan Harris appeared again. He'd been circling the idea of buying Margaret's property for some time, but she wasn't interested. This time he came with an offer that seemed even more tempting, an opportunity to partner with him on a real estate venture. But Margaret knew what he was after. She wasn't going to let him control her decisions. "No, Evan," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not interested in working with you." Evan's smile faltered, but he quickly masked his disappointment. "All right, Margaret, but remember, the offer still stands." As he walked away, Margaret felt a small sense of relief. She wasn't going to give in to his pressure. That evening, Margaret received a message from Carlos. "I need to talk to you about something important regarding Lily." Her heart skipped a beat. What now? Margaret sat across from Carlos in the sleek, glass-walled conference room, the city skyline stretching behind him. The weight of the moment felt heavy in her chest, but it wasn't fear. It was something else. A quiet, palpable anticipation. She had been working hard to build her reputation, and now the next step was waiting for her. This meeting was more than just a decision about one house. It was about what came next for her business, her life. She was done being underestimated. "Margaret," Carlos said, breaking the silence. He slid a folder across the table, his eyes scanning her face as if gauging her reaction. "The market is hot right now. You've already built a solid foundation here, but you have the potential to go bigger. I've lined up a meeting with a developer who's interested in working with you, if you want to take the leap." Margaret's fingers brushed over the folder, her gaze flicking briefly to the glossy pages filled with listings and financial projections. She had done well on her own, but the thought of expanding her portfolio, of joining forces with a powerful developer, it felt like the next logical step. And yet there was a lingering doubt in the back of her mind. She didn't want to lose herself in someone else's vision. "I'm listening," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the uncertainty she felt inside. Carlos leaned forward, his tone eager but cautious. "You've got the know-how, the experience. This partnership could solidify your place as a key player in the industry. You wouldn't just be an investor. You'd be a force to be reckoned with." Margaret's pulse quickened. This was the moment. The path she'd been walking for years, the one of self-sufficiency and quiet resilience, was now leading her to a crossroads. Could she go even bigger? Should she? "You think I'm ready?" Margaret asked, her eyes narrowing slightly as she met his gaze. Carlos nodded, his smile reassuring. "You've proven yourself time and time again, Margaret. This is your chance to step up and claim your place." She let the words settle. The quiet of the room was almost too loud as she considered the possibilities. She had worked so hard to be seen as more than just James's wife, more than just a woman in a man's world. Now, with the house next door, with this potential partnership, she had the chance to take control, not just of her life, but of an entire industry. After a long moment of silence, Margaret leaned forward, her decision crystal clear in her mind. "I'm in," she said, her voice steady, stronger than ever. "Let's do it." Carlos's eyes brightened. "You won't regret this." Later that day, as Margaret stepped into her house next door, the hum of activity from the contractors filled the air. The walls were taking shape, the rooms transforming with every stroke of paint, every nail hammered into place. It was no longer just a house, it was the embodiment of her independence. Her dream was coming to life. Her phone buzzed again, and she felt a familiar tightness in her chest. It was a message from Lily. "I've been thinking. I know I've been hard on you, Mom. I just want to help. I think we should talk. I'm worried about you." Margaret stared at the screen, feeling a rush of conflicting emotions. She had known this conversation was coming, but it didn't change the fact that Lily still didn't understand her decision. She wasn't worried about her daughter's concern anymore. She was past that. "I've made my decision, Lily. I'm doing this for myself, not anyone else. I hope you can understand that." Margaret didn't wait for a response. Instead, she walked through the rooms of the house, feeling the energy of change surrounding her. She was doing this, not for approval, not for anyone else's idea of what was best, but because it was what she wanted. As she stood in the center of the living room, a soft smile touched her lips. She was building something bigger than a house. She was building a future, one that no one could take away from her. The next morning, as Margaret prepared for a meeting with the developer, her phone buzzed again. It was a text from Lily. "I'm proud of you, Mom. I'm sorry I didn't understand before. Let's talk soon." Margaret let out a breath, a small weight lifting from her shoulders. Maybe there was hope after all, but it didn't change her course. She had made her decision. She was ready for whatever came next. Margaret's rise in the real estate world was undeniable. What started as a simple decision to buy the house next door had turned into something far bigger. Her name was becoming synonymous with independence and success. She was no longer just the woman who had taken a chance on a property. She was a force in the industry, with her influence spreading beyond the neighborhood and into the city. Her phone buzzed constantly. Texts, emails, and calls from people she hadn't heard from in years. Neighbors, friends, and even old colleagues were reaching out for advice, eager to learn from the woman who had defied expectations. Margaret embraced the attention, not for the praise, but because it validated everything she had worked for. She was building something lasting, something no one could take away. But amid her growing success, there was one voice that still echoed in her mind: Lily's. Margaret had hoped time and distance would help her daughter understand, but instead, Lily seemed more distant and resentful than ever. Every conversation felt like an uphill battle. Lily tried to show interest in Margaret's projects, but it always felt like she was more focused on what she could gain rather than offering true support. One evening, Lily called. "Mom, I've been thinking," she started, her voice softer than usual. "I want to help. I can take some of the pressure off, work on your projects with you. We could really make something of this together." Margaret sighed inwardly, the weight of the conversation settling heavily on her. She knew Lily wasn't offering help out of concern for Margaret's well-being. It was about control. She had heard the same offers before, but this time it felt different. There was something in Lily's tone that wasn't genuine. "I'm fine, Lily," Margaret said, her voice steady. "I've got everything under control." There was a brief silence, followed by a reluctant, "Okay, Mom, just know that I'm here if you change your mind." Margaret hung up the phone, her chest tight with a mixture of frustration and sadness. Lily's jealousy and frustration were impossible to ignore, but Margaret knew she couldn't let her daughter's expectations derail her path. This was her life now, and she had earned the right to live it on her own terms. As Margaret continued to push forward with her business, she received an unexpected call from Evan Harris. He had been keeping his distance since his earlier attempts to buy her out, but now he was back with an offer to partner on a large-scale development project. The temptation to expand was there, but Margaret could already sense what Evan was really after: control. "No, Evan," Margaret said firmly, her resolve unwavering. "I'm not interested in partnering with you. This is my vision." Evan didn't push. Instead, he offered a polite smile and walked away, leaving Margaret to focus on her future. As she sat in her office later that day, Margaret reflected on how far she had come. She had taken control of her life, defied expectations, and proven to herself and everyone else that she was more than capable. Margaret sat at the edge of her desk, watching the sunlight spill into her office through the large windows. The real estate market had been kind to her over the past year, and now, with each passing day, her investments were growing, What had started as a bold step into new territory had evolved into a thriving empire. She was no longer simply a survivor of circumstance. She was a testament to perseverance, ambition, and independence. Her phone buzzed on the desk, interrupting her thoughts. It was another deal confirmation, yet another property she had purchased, another opportunity to expand. The pace was exhausting, but in the best way possible. Margaret had never been afraid of hard work, and now it was paying off. She had built a foundation that would set her up for years, securing not just her future, but her financial independence. Retirement? She had pushed that thought aside for now. With her portfolio growing, she realized she might never fully retire, and that didn't bother her in the slightest. This was her life, her creation. In the midst of all the hustle, Margaret had found herself shifting her focus. She had always been driven by the idea of success, but now, with the foundation she'd built, she was thinking about what came next. What did she want her legacy to be? She wasn't just interested in wealth, she wanted to make a difference. She started focusing on giving back, using her success to support local charities and young entrepreneurs who reminded her of herself. She mentored women looking to break into the real estate industry, offering guidance and advice. She had been where they were, uncertain, overlooked, fighting for a place at the table. And now she was ready to open doors for others. But even as she forged new paths, Lily was never far from her thoughts. The rift between them hadn't healed, and Margaret couldn't shake the memory of their last conversation. Lily had tried reaching out, but Margaret remained cautious, unwilling to return to the dynamic that had held her back for so long. Despite Lily's efforts to make amends, Margaret couldn't just ignore the years of unspoken resentment that had built up. It was too late to go back to what they once had, and Margaret knew it. Still, part of her hoped for a change, a shift. She wasn't sure what exactly it would take, but she couldn't completely close that door. That evening, Margaret was invited to speak at a major conference on female empowerment in business. It was a huge opportunity, one that would put her name alongside other influential women in the industry. She had worked hard to get here, and now she was being recognized not just for her business acumen, but for what she represented: strength, defiance, and the ability to carve her own path. Sophie helped her prepare her speech. "You've done it all on your own, Margaret," she said. "Now it's time to show everyone what you've built. This isn't just about the house next door, it's about everything you've achieved." The night of the event, as Margaret stood before a sea of faces, her heart pounded with excitement. But it wasn't fear. This was her moment. She spoke of overcoming family expectations, of battling against the norms that had once held her back. She spoke about creating her own future, not waiting for permission. As the words flowed, she could see the faces of the audience light up, nodding in agreement. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. She felt a deep sense of pride. It was more than an achievement, it was a statement. She had built something lasting, something that would outlive her. As she mingled after her speech, Margaret was approached by a woman who ran a national real estate foundation. "You're exactly the kind of leader this industry needs," the woman said. "We need more women like you. You're changing the game." Margaret smiled, grateful for the recognition, but her thoughts turned to Lily. Could she have done more to heal that relationship? Was it too late? The complexity of their bond weighed on her. She wasn't sure what she wanted from Lily anymore, but she couldn't deny that the silence between them felt heavy. Later that night, Margaret received a text from her daughter. "I'm proud of you, Mom. I see what you've done now. I'm sorry for everything. Can we talk?" For a moment, Margaret sat staring at the message. Could she forgive Lily? Could they rebuild from the ashes of old misunderstandings? But before she could respond, her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Carlos. "I've got another project on the table. This one could put you on the map nationally. Let's meet." Margaret's pulse quickened. Another opportunity? Or was it time to shift gears once more? Margaret's life had evolved into something she hadn't dared to imagine a few years ago. As she sat in her sleek, sunlit office, overlooking the city she had come to know so well, she could hardly believe the journey she had taken. The investments, the challenges, and the triumphs had all led her here, to a place of success, independence, and unshakable confidence. Every new project was another step in a journey that had begun with a simple decision to buy the house next door. Now she was a respected name in real estate, with national investors knocking on her door. Her phone buzzed on the desk, the screen lighting up with another business inquiry. It was a routine part of her day now, but it still sent a thrill through her. Margaret had made a name for herself in ways that went beyond real estate. She was a beacon of what was possible when you refused to let life dictate your terms. But even as her empire grew, the shadow of her strained relationship with Lily loomed over her. Margaret couldn't help but feel the weight of the silence between them. Lily had reached out a few times, and there was an unmistakable shift in her tone, an attempt at reconciliation. But Margaret wasn't sure how to move forward with her daughter. The distance had become too great, the misunderstandings too deep. Margaret had worked hard to get where she was, and part of her felt a quiet resentment at the years lost in trying to please Lily. Then, one afternoon, as Margaret was reviewing new investment proposals, she received another text from her daughter. "I've been thinking, and I want to start fresh. I see how much you've accomplished. I'm proud of you, Mom. I just wanted you to know that." Margaret sat back, letting the words sink in. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lily's message was free of the expectations that had once defined their relationship. But it came too late, and Margaret couldn't shake the sense that things had already shifted beyond repair. The business world was calling to her louder than ever. She had set her sights on expanding beyond the local market. Her brand had become a powerful force, and now national developers were interested in partnering with her. The momentum of her success seemed unstoppable, and she was ready for whatever came next. Later that week, Sophie helped her prepare for a major public speaking event. Margaret was invited to speak at a female empowerment conference, a prestigious occasion that would put her in the company of some of the most influential women in business. As she practiced her speech, Sophie reminded her, "This isn't just about the house anymore, Margaret. It's about everything you've built. You've created something that will outlive you." On the night of the event, Margaret took the stage with a sense of calm. She spoke about perseverance, about defying expectations, and about what it meant to truly own your decisions. When the applause came, it was deafening, and Margaret stood tall, knowing that her journey wasn't just hers to tell, it was now a story for others to follow. Margaret's influence in the real estate industry had surpassed all expectations. What had started with a simple purchase had grown into a powerful empire. She wasn't just a successful entrepreneur, she had become a symbol of what was possible when a woman refused to be silenced by others' expectations. Her name was known across the industry, and her projects were generating waves of admiration. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. Another deal. Another opportunity to expand her reach. It was a routine now, one that Margaret had come to expect. But still, it sent a thrill through her every time. She was no longer just operating locally. Her name was reaching national and soon international levels. Investors were eager to work with her, and developers were seeking her expertise. But even as her business flourished, Lily's shadow lingered in the back of her mind. They had been in a strange limbo for months. The apology from Lily, while heartfelt, had come too late to heal all the wounds. Margaret had worked so hard to reach this point, and part of her still resented the years of tension. But she knew that she couldn't allow the past to define her future. The woman she had become was too strong for that. Lily had made progress of her own, Margaret had heard. The reports were vague, but it was clear that her daughter was finding her own way, though it was no easy path. Margaret had no desire to interfere, but the reality was that their relationship had changed. It was different now, but the door wasn't closed completely. That night, Margaret was invited to an exclusive event, an evening dedicated to empowering women in business. It was a prestigious gathering, and her presence was not just expected, it was celebrated. Sophie, ever the grounded advisor, had helped Margaret prepare her speech, urging her to speak from the heart about what she had built, about the legacy she wanted to leave. Margaret had prepared for this moment for years. When she took the stage, the room fell into a hush, the anticipation palpable. She spoke of the challenges, the failures, and ultimately the triumphs. She spoke of women who had been overlooked, sidelined, and silenced. "I've spent my life fighting for my place," she said, "but now I fight for all of us. We all deserve a seat at the table." The applause that followed was deafening. Margaret stood tall, her heart swelling with pride. This wasn't just about her success. It was about paving the way for those who came after her. She was showing the world that women could lead, could dominate, and could build legacies of their own. After the speech, she caught sight of Lily standing in the back of the room. Their eyes met across the crowd. There was no judgment, no anger in Lily's expression, only a quiet understanding. For the first time in years, Margaret felt a flicker of hope that they could rebuild what had been broken. But that was a future she couldn't control. As the event ended, Margaret's phone buzzed. It was a message from Carlos. "I've just received a global offer for your next project. It's massive. Are you ready?" Margaret's heart skipped a beat. The world was opening up in ways she hadn't imagined. What was next? Margaret sat on the balcony of her penthouse apartment. The skyline of a new city stretching out before her like a canvas waiting to be painted. The city lights flickered in the distance, but in her heart there was nothing but calm. The frantic pace of the last few years had slowed to a manageable hum, and she had finally settled into a rhythm of success. Her business was no longer just a local enterprise. It had expanded globally, with her name now recognized in major cities around the world. Margaret was an international figure in real estate, a woman who had built an empire from nothing but sheer will and a vision that no one had dared to believe in, except for her. As she sipped her coffee, Margaret reflected on how far she had come. She had worked tirelessly, day after day, building her business, proving the world wrong. She'd done it all for herself, not for anyone's approval, but now that she had it, it felt like the perfect reward. She had given everything to this empire, and now the fruits of her labor were sweeter than she could have imagined. Travel had become a regular part of her life. Conferences in Paris, property negotiations in London, site visits in Tokyo. She reveled in the excitement of exploring new cities, meeting new people, and forging new partnerships. Each journey felt like another milestone in the life she had carefully crafted, and yet, as much as she enjoyed the luxury of the life she had built, she knew that this success wasn't just about the properties or the money. It was about the freedom to live life on her own terms. Margaret had spent decades building the life she wanted. Now she was reaping the rewards. She was spending more time on what truly mattered to her, enjoying the people she loved, the experiences she had earned, and the adventures that awaited her. But even in the midst of all this, there was still work to be done. She continued to mentor other women in the real estate industry, giving back to the community that had once been a place where she had struggled to find her footing. Margaret had created a platform for others to rise with her, and that was something that filled her with pride. But her relationship with Lily still lingered in her thoughts. While they had both made peace with the distance between them, Margaret could tell that her daughter respected her strength. Lily had built her own path, found her own way, and while their paths didn't cross as often as Margaret had once hoped, there was a quiet understanding between them. Margaret was proud of her daughter for finding her own success, and though their relationship had been fractured, it seemed to have healed in a way that neither could have imagined years ago. As Margaret checked her phone, she saw a new message from Lily. "I'm proud of you, Mom. I'm really proud of everything you've built." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of silence. Margaret smiled softly, a sense of peace settling over her. Maybe their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was enough. It was a reminder that, in the end, they had both found their way. With her empire solidified and her personal life more stable than it had ever been, Margaret felt the freedom she had longed for. The fear, the uncertainty, those things were behind her now. She was no longer bound by expectations or the weight of anyone else's opinion. She had carved out a life for herself, and she was finally living it. Margaret looked out over the city one last time that night, the lights twinkling below her. She had created something lasting, something that would live on far beyond her years. Her work had been a legacy, not just in terms of real estate, but in the way it had empowered others to follow their own dreams. As she prepared for her next venture, she knew one thing for sure. Her journey wasn't over. She had built her empire, but there was still more to do, more to give. Margaret Thompson was just getting started. The years had been kind to Margaret, and as she sat on the terrace of her New York penthouse, overlooking the city she had now conquered, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had built her empire from the ground up, starting with the purchase of a single house next door. Now her name was recognized across the country, and her influence reached across continents. She had become a force in the real estate world, a woman who had proven that with hard work, determination, and vision, anything was possible. But it was more than the properties, the numbers, and the acquisitions. It was the lives she had touched, the women she had mentored, and the doors she had opened. Margaret had spent so much time focusing on her own success that it had been easy to forget the responsibility that came with it. Now, with her legacy solidified, she could see the impact she had on the next generation of women in business. Her phone buzzed, and it was a message from one of her mentees, a young woman she had helped break into the real estate industry a few years ago. The message read, "Thank you for everything, Margaret. Because of you, I've just landed my first major deal. I wouldn't have believed in myself without your guidance." A smile crossed Margaret's face. She had spent years fighting for her place, for her voice to be heard, and now she was helping others do the same. That was her true success, seeing women rise, empowered by the lessons she had learned the hard way. The message reminded her of the core reason she had done everything she had done. It had never been about money or recognition. It had been about carving out a space for women who had been told they weren't enough, who had been dismissed and overlooked. She had built something lasting, a legacy that was about more than properties. It was about making the world a better place for the next generation of women in business. As the years had passed, her relationship with Lily had evolved. The space between them, once so wide and unbridgeable, had closed. They still didn't speak every day, but they had found a new understanding. Lily had begun to see her mother in a new light, not as the woman who had always been strong, but as the woman who had worked relentlessly to get there. Margaret's strength, which had once felt like a barrier, had now become the foundation on which Lily could stand. The healing process hadn't been easy. The years of distance couldn't be undone in a day. But every time they spoke, it felt like another piece of the puzzle was falling into place. There was still a gap between them, but it was a gap Margaret was willing to bridge. She had no illusions about what their relationship would look like, but they were moving forward. Margaret leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath, the weight of her journey settling into her bones. She had come so far, from the woman who was ready to sell her family home to the woman whose name was now on the tip of everyone's tongue. She had done it all for herself, never waiting for permission, never asking for approval. It had been her vision that had driven her forward. And now, she was passing that vision on. Her thoughts turned to the next generation, the women she had mentored, the women she had inspired. It wasn't enough to have succeeded on her own. She wanted to build a legacy of women who would continue what she had started, who would break barriers and claim their place at the table. She had already seen the beginnings of that in her mentees and in the stories they shared. Margaret's gaze shifted to the horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip below the skyline. There was still so much to do. She had built her empire, but now she had the chance to shape the future. She wasn't just a figurehead in the real estate world. She was a trailblazer, a woman who had proved that anything was possible when you believed in yourself. She stood up,